The air on the set of The Godfather was thick, not just with the usual Hollywood hustle, but with an unspoken tension. Voices, normally buzzing with activity, died down to whispers, then to nothing at all. Every eye turned towards the soundstage entrance. A figure emerged, casting a long shadow across the artificial New York street. This wasn't an actor. This was Carmine the Snake Valenti, a name that carried weight far beyond the movie industry. He was a notorious, real-life mafia boss, and his presence was like a sudden cold draft on a warm day. Valenti moved with an unsettling calm, his expensive suit seemingly out of place, yet completely dominant in the creative chaos of the film set. He didn't acknowledge anyone, his gaze fixed straight ahead, an unspoken challenge in his stride. He walked directly to where Marlon Brando sat, deep in character as Vito Corleone, between takes. Brando, with his prosthetic jowls and aged makeup, looked every bit the powerful aging Don. The contrast was stark. The manufactured power of the screen meeting the raw, undeniable power of the street. Valenti stopped directly in front of Brando. The silence was absolute. You could almost hear the collective breath held by everyone on set. Then Valenti spoke, his voice low, but cutting through the quiet like a knife. "Too soft," he said, his eyes drilling into Brando's. "Your Don, he's too soft. Not how a real Don moves, not how he talks." It was more than a critique. It was an insult, a dismissal of Brando's dedication, his craft, and everything he poured into embodying the role. It was a direct challenge to the very essence of the artist. Instead of flinching, instead of anger or fear, Brando did something unexpected. A slow, deliberate smile formed on his face, a glint in his eyes that suggested not defiance, but a deeper understanding, almost an amusement. He reached up, subtly adjusting one of his prosthetic jowls, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. It was a movement that seemed to absorb Valenti's harsh words, taking them in rather than pushing them away. It was as if Brando was saying, "I hear you, and I understand more than you think." Valenti for a moment was thrown off balance. His confident posture wavered, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. He clearly hadn't expected this reaction. His usual tactics of intimidation were met with an almost serene calm, a quiet power that was unfamiliar and unsettling to him. His men, who had followed him onto the set, shifted uncomfortably. They sensed it too, an unexpected shift in the power dynamics, a moment where their boss's authority seemed to momentarily slip. Some men mistake quiet for weakness, but some quiet holds the power of an ocean. Brando, having delivered his silent response, simply turned his head back towards the director, ready for the next take, leaving Valenti standing alone, his challenge unmet, his authority subtly undermined. The real Don had met his match, not in a fight, but in a quiet, knowing glance. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. This unexpected encounter wasn't just a random event. It was a clash of worlds, deeply rooted in the vibrant, yet often cutthroat landscape of 1970s Hollywood. Picture it. The studio backlots of Paramount, a place where dreams were manufactured daily, but also where ambition and raw power often collided. Actors like Brando, celebrated for their method acting, were under immense pressure, not just from the studio, but from their own dedication to deliver performances that would become legendary. This was an era when an actor didn't just play a role. They lived it, breathed it, becoming almost indistinguishable from the characters they portrayed. Brando, in particular, was known for disappearing into his roles, a process that demanded absolute immersion and an almost spiritual commitment. Hollywood in those days had a complex, often murky relationship with organized crime. It wasn't always obvious, but beneath the glitz and glamour, a shadow world existed, influencing deals, shaping productions, and sometimes, as in Valenti's case, making its presence felt directly on set. The lines between legitimate business and underworld influence were often blurred, creating a unique tension that permeated the entire industry. Brando's personal life only added to his enigmatic persona. He had a reputation for being fiercely independent, dedicated to his craft, but also famously difficult, with a history of sometimes volatile relationships with directors and producers. He was a force of nature, an artist who refused to compromise his vision, even when it put him at odds with powerful figures. Los Angeles itself, at that time, was a fascinating blend of aspirations and anxieties. A city where glamour and ambition walked hand in hand with simmering tensions and hidden power struggles. On the other side of this dramatic confrontation stood Carmine Valenti, a man forged in a very different kind of fire. He had risen through the brutal ranks of the New York crime families, building a reputation for ruthlessness and an unwavering will to dominate. His influence wasn't confined to the back alleys of the East Coast. It stretched into various industries, including, increasingly, entertainment. For Valenti, power was about control, about making people bend to his will, and he saw Hollywood as just another territory to conquer. The emotional landscape beneath this interaction was rich and complex. Brando's deep commitment to embodying Vito Corleone went beyond mere acting. For him, it was an almost spiritual possession, a quest to understand and portray the very essence of a powerful, complex man. He wasn't just playing a character, he was channeling an archetype. Valenti, on the other hand, saw himself as a real Don. This self-perception made him incredibly sensitive to any perceived misrepresentation of his world, any portrayal that didn't align with his own rigid understanding of power and respect. For him, Brando's soft Don wasn't just bad acting, it was an insult to his very identity, a challenge to his authority in a world he believed he intimately understood. He believed he was the ultimate authority on what a real Don looked and acted like, and Brando's portrayal, in his eyes, fell short, warranting a direct, intimidating correction. This wasn't just about a movie. It was about two powerful figures, each operating in their own sphere, clashing over the very definition of power and authenticity. Valenti's appearance on the set wasn't really a surprise to anyone who had been around Hollywood for a while. There were whispers, stories from other productions. He had a history of subtle intimidation, of making his presence felt without ever really getting his hands dirty. Memories floated around the studios, tales of how Valenti's men would show up, just watch things, and suddenly a director would change a scene, or an actor would alter a performance. It was always quiet, always indirect, but everyone knew what it meant. He had a way of subtly twisting things, of making people compromise their artistic vision without a direct threat ever being spoken. These tactics had caused delays, cost money, and, more importantly, chipped away at the artistic integrity of various projects. Filmmakers, writers, and actors had learned to work within these unspoken boundaries, to navigate the tricky waters of pleasing both the studio and the shadowy figures who seemed to hold sway over certain aspects of the industry. The pressure on The Godfather production itself was already immense, even before Valenti stepped foot on set. Studio executives were constantly looking over their shoulders, worried about potential interference from real-life mobsters, knowing that a misstep could have serious consequences, not just for the film, but for their careers. Brando, too, had his own past experiences with people trying to dictate his artistic choices. He was a veteran, a legend, and he had faced down plenty of powerful individuals who wanted him to conform, to play things their way. Each time, he had responded with a quiet but firm resistance, a refusal to bend his artistic principles. He understood that true art couldn't be commanded or controlled by outside forces. He knew the difference between a creative suggestion and an order given under duress. Valenti's manipulations were always clever. He rarely made direct demands. Instead, he'd use intermediaries, sending suggestions through people who had connections, people who owed him favors. These suggestions would subtly undermine creative freedom, making directors second-guess their instincts, making actors question their interpretations. It was a slow poison, eating away at the collaborative spirit of filmmaking, replacing it with a pervasive sense of unease. The growing frustration within the industry was palpable, even if rarely spoken aloud. People hated the encroachment of organized crime, the way it tried to muddy the clear waters of creative expression. But a pervasive fear prevented open defiance. No one wanted to be the one to stand up and risk everything. The stakes were too high, the potential consequences too severe. So most people just grumbled quietly, made their compromises, and tried to get their films made. When Valenti showed up on the soundstage of The Godfather, it wasn't just a random visit. For those in the know, it was the culmination of years of thinly veiled threats, a bold statement born from a deep-seated belief in his own untouchability. He thought he could walk onto any set, make any demand, and everyone would simply fall in line. He had done it before, and he expected to do it again. He believed his presence alone was enough to enforce his will, to ensure that the portrayal of a mob boss met his exact and very specific standards. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was the natural progression of his long-standing pattern of exerting control over a world he felt entitled to influence. The atmosphere on The Godfather set, already charged with the intensity of bringing such a complex story to life, became increasingly heavy following Valenti's initial visit. It was as if a dark cloud had settled over Paramount Studios, casting a shadow that permeated every corner of the production. Valenti himself might have left, but his presence lingered, a constant, unsettling reminder. His men were seen lingering around the studio gates, sometimes even walking through the lot, their eyes scanning, their faces unreadable. Their presence wasn't aggressive, not overtly, but it was enough to make everyone nervous. It was a constant, implicit threat, a silent message that Valenti was watching, always. Whispers started circulating among the crew and cast hushed conversations in hallways and during lunch breaks. Everyone knew Valenti was displeased, and that knowledge created a climate of fear and anxiety. People started looking over their shoulders, wondering if their actions, their words, might somehow be misinterpreted or reported back to the crime boss. The easy camaraderie that often defined a film set began to fray around the edges, replaced by a subtle tension. No one wanted to be the reason Valenti decided to make a more forceful statement. Brando, despite his outward calm, felt this shift in the air. He was a master observer, picking up on the subtlest cues. He saw the glances, heard the hushed tones, and in response, he subtly intensified his portrayal of Vito Corleone. It wasn't a conscious act of defiance, not exactly, but an almost instinctive deepening of his craft. He added new layers of controlled menace and gravitas to the Don, making him even more formidable, more commanding. It was as if he was absorbing the external pressure and channeling it directly into his performance, transforming the threat into artistic fuel. His Vito became even more authentic, more powerful, a living embodiment of defiance through art. Discussions between director Francis Ford Coppola and the studio heads became noticeably more strained. They were grappling with the immense challenge of protecting their artistic vision from these external pressures. Coppola was a visionary, but also acutely aware of the practical realities of filmmaking, including the need to keep the studio happy and the production running smoothly. Now, an entirely new, unpredictable element had been introduced. Every decision, every creative choice, felt like it was being weighed not just for its artistic merit, but for its potential to appease or provoke Valenti. The stakes felt incredibly high, not just for the film's success, but for the safety and peace of mind of everyone involved. Brando felt the weight of expectation from his colleagues and the industry as a whole. He knew his response to Valenti could set a precedent. If he yielded to intimidation, it would embolden others to try and dictate artistic choices. If he stood firm, it might inspire others, but it also carried significant risk. He was keenly aware that his actions were being watched, not just by the crew, but by countless others in Hollywood who had long suffered in silence under similar pressures. The pressure built to a suffocating level. Every day on set felt like walking a tightrope. The threat of Valenti's wrath hung over every scene, every line of dialogue, every decision made by Coppola and the producers. It wasn't just about making a great film anymore. It was about navigating a dangerous, unseen battlefield where the weapons were not guns, but fear and influence. The line between the fictional world of the Corleones and the very real world of organized crime seemed to blur more with each passing day, making the set of The Godfather feel less like a creative haven and more like a besieged fortress. The suffocating tension on set reached its peak during a particularly intense scene Brando was filming as Vito Corleone. It was a crucial moment in the story, one where the Don asserted his authority with quiet, unwavering resolve. Brando had spent hours in makeup, perfecting the aged, weary wisdom in Vito's eyes, the slight droop of his jowls. He was fully immersed, not just in the character, but in the very essence of the man. The air around him seemed to thicken, charged with the concentrated energy of his performance. The crew moved with hushed reverence, almost afraid to disturb the fragile bubble of creation he had formed. Then, without warning, the studio doors swung open. Carmine Valenti reappeared, and this time his entrance was even more dramatic. He wasn't alone. A larger entourage of his men, perhaps 10 or 12, followed him, their dark suits and stern faces creating an immediate, jarring contrast to the artistic chaos of the film set. Valenti's eyes scanned the room, a clear message of dominance in his gaze, intending to make a more forceful statement, to remind everyone who truly held power. He strode directly towards the set, his footsteps echoing in the sudden silence, his presence a dark cloud descending upon the creative space. Brando, however, remained oblivious, or perhaps chose to be. He was deep within Vito Corleone. The camera rolled, and Brando delivered his lines, words from the script that spoke of loyalty, betrayal, and the harsh consequences of disrespect. His voice, a gravelly whisper, filled the soundstage, carrying an unexpected weight. He spoke of family, of honor, of debts that must be paid. Each word was not just spoken but felt, imbued with a chilling authenticity and a deep, undeniable authority. It transcended mere acting. It became a declaration, a fundamental truth articulated by a man who understood the intricate dance of power and respect. The line, specifically about how a man's word was his bond and how broken bonds led to inevitable downfall, resonated deeply and unexpectedly with Valenti. For a moment, the crime boss seemed to freeze. His usual bravado faltered. The sneer that often played on his lips softened, replaced by a look of genuine, almost bewildered recognition. He stood there, surrounded by his enforcers, yet suddenly isolated by the sheer force of Brando's performance. For a brief moment, Valenti saw not just an actor in heavy makeup, but a reflection of a powerful figure. A man who commanded respect not through brute force, but through an inherent understanding of the world they both inhabited. It was a profound, unsettling connection. Valenti, who built his empire on intimidation and fear, suddenly found himself confronting a truth he knew intimately, but delivered by someone he had dismissed as a mere performer. He saw the wisdom in Vito's eyes, the weariness, the unshakable resolve. He saw the heavy burden of leadership, the cost of power. In that instant, the cycle of intimidation, the pretense of his own superiority, broke. Valenti realized Brando wasn't merely acting, he was embodying a truth that Valenti understood on a fundamental level, a truth about the nature of power, respect, and consequences that resonated in his very bones. This was a revelation for Valenti. Brando was not just mimicking a mob boss. He was, in that moment, becoming one, not through violence, but through sheer force of character and authenticity. He was tapping into something primal and real, something Valenti recognized from his own life. The line between fiction and reality blurred, and in that blurring Brando, as Vito Corleone, achieved a victory far more significant than any physical confrontation. He had reached Valenti on a deeper level, touching a chord that no threat or display of power ever could. The true power of art, raw and unadorned, had just been unleashed, and Valenti, the hardened mob boss, was its unexpected, unwilling captive. Valenti, visibly shaken by Brando's performance, quickly exited the set without another word, his entourage following in confused silence. The abruptness of his departure was almost as startling as his initial appearance. He didn't issue threats, didn't make demands, he simply turned and left, a man who had seen something he hadn't expected. The immediate aftermath on set was a mixture of relief and a kind of bewildered awe. Crew members exchanged glances, some openly gasping, others simply stunned by this completely unexpected turn of events. Coppola, his face a mix of profound respect and slight fear, approached Brando. He didn't need to say anything. His expression acknowledged the immense, almost palpable power Brando had just wielded. The news of Valenti's silent departure spread like wildfire throughout Hollywood, sparking intense speculation and a swift shift in perception. Suddenly, the unshakable Carmine Valenti had been shaken. Some industry figures, previously intimidated by Valenti, began to subtly challenge his influence, emboldened by Brando's quiet defiance. It was a ripple effect, starting small, but growing. Brando himself experienced a quiet satisfaction, but also a deep exhaustion from the emotional toll of such a confrontation. He understood the psychological weight of standing up to such a force, even if it was done through art. The cultural dynamics of Hollywood, for a brief yet significant moment, began to subtly shift, as the power of artistic expression momentarily triumphed over brute force. The production of The Godfather continued with a renewed focus and a powerful sense of collective purpose. The shadow of direct mob interference, which had loomed so heavily, began to recede. Valenti's reputation among the Hollywood elite took a significant hit. His aura of invincibility was subtly, yet undeniably diminished. He was no longer seen as an unquestionable authority figure on set, his word not quite the law it once was. This led to a gradual, almost imperceptible decline in his ability to directly influence film productions. He still held power, of course, but that particular brand of fear he projected onto creative endeavors had been broken. Brando's performance as Vito Corleone became legendary, lauded not just for its artistic merit, for every nuance and every calculated gesture, but also for the quiet defiance it represented against real-world intimidation. It wasn't just a role, it was a statement. The film, unburdened by outside pressures, went on to become a cinematic masterpiece, a testament to artistic integrity prevailing over external forces. Its success was a victory for cinema, for storytelling, and for the courageous acts, both big and small, that allowed it to flourish. Brando's act of subtle resistance, his ability to disarm a real-life threat with nothing but his talent and the depth of his portrayal, solidified his status not just as an actor, but as a figure who commanded respect through sheer artistry and conviction. He didn't need a gun or muscle. He had his craft. The story of that day, of the real mob boss humbled by an actor, became a whispered legend, adding another layer to Brando's already mythical status. The narrative of this encounter concludes with a powerful reflection on the enduring power of art to challenge and transform even the most hardened individuals. It shows that sometimes the greatest strength isn't found in brute force or threats, but in the raw, authentic expression of truth, even if it's within a fictional character. The ultimate justice for Valenti was not a prison sentence or a violent end, but a loss of respect and influence in the very world he sought to control. His reign over the creative sphere was subtly undermined, his power diminished by something he couldn't understand or fight against. Genuine artistic brilliance. Brando's legacy, on the other hand, is forever cemented as an icon who mastered his craft, and in doing so, faced down a real-life threat with nothing but his talent. He proved that art isn't just entertainment. It can be a weapon, a shield, and a profound force for change. His portrayal of Vito Corleone wasn't just acting. It was an experience that transcended the screen, leaving an indelible mark on Hollywood and on the